over 17,000 gallons, I told you he had a lot, of saltwater corals, fish, which are imported, grown, and sold wholesale. So if you're not familiar with who ACI is, you need to be. Jake Adams goes without introduction. If you don't know who reef builders are, then, well, I don't know. You must not have the internet. So Jake worked in pet stores since the 90s, went to the University of South Carolina for marine science, joined Reef Builders in 2008, and is continually creating unique content for the reefing industry. I guarantee you, sometime in the near future, this whole ordeal will be on his channel, done up to the nines. So, gentlemen, please take it away.
Richard and the whole entire crew. So,
yeah, so I've actually been organizing an aquarium event of my own since 2008 called Reef Stock. The next one's going to be in 5 weeks. And the first time you do this show, you learn so much about how to do it, and there's just like this huge learning curve. So the Waterbox guys, like, you know, they're trying to do something a little bit different. So I don't want a round of applause. I want you to approach them individually, just one. You know, if each of you approaches one person and tell them, you know, what this event meant to you and brought us together and talk about it, give them a little bit of love. So as we were introduced, you know, Chris has a lot of big tanks, and then I have a good number of small and medium-sized tanks. And together, you know, we only have so many hours in the day and so much labor. So we've, you know, been riffing about different ways that we can streamline the process of taking care of our aquariums. It's kind of funny to us when someone says that one aquarium is a lot of maintenance, and like, there's definitely a lot of efficiencies that you can have through the aquarium maintenance, especially if you do it smart. So go ahead, this is your facility.
well, this is our newest farm system that we just put in. My son Isaac's in it, so you can kind of see how big just the holding system is itself. And then you have all the lighting that goes on it with the protein skimmers. We also have calcium reactor, which was not hooked up in the very beginning here. But when you take and maintain a system of this size, it is completely different than maintaining something in a 20-gallon, even up to, say, a 200-gallon system. It requires a lot of dedication to maintain your water from the time you set it up until it is fully cycled and your system is pristine and your corals are actually growing. With this system, it took us about 5 months to get it to the point where we ended up having to put the calcium reactor on it to the point where we were dosing the system daily with alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, and of course also the beginning stages of every cycle that people understand is you're going to have your different stages of algae growing, and we went through all of that, which is never fun. Always putting corals in to test them out, see how things are going, and constantly having to scrub coral fragments is not fun. So we kept it to a bare minimum in the beginning, and now that it's up and running and in perfect condition, in my opinion, it's almost maintenance free. If you set it up that way.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So one of the things that we talk a lot about, and that I'm approached about very frequently, is about all these water testing robots. You know, you have all these little machines from $500 to $1,000 that either test one thing or test a variety of elements, and they're very expensive. They have a lot of different approaches to how they do things, but I always kind of snicker because I have a system that I've developed at the studio for testing a ton of water very reliably. So let me show you that real quick. So I have a lot to talk about when it comes to water sampling. So salinity it still kind of shocks me when people use specific gravity. I know his guys use specific gravity to describe the sea level concentration of their water, but that's not right, and it gets you into trouble. So one of my favorite new salinity checkers is the one from Hanna. I'm sure most of you over the last decade have gravitated from hydrometers to refractometers, but this conductivity meter from Hanna is my understanding that is the most accurate way to measure salinity digitally.
For a hobbyist level. And I agree with those things, they're great for easy, but when we test our salinity, we use a floating hydrometer that's scientifically calibrated so that we are, lab grade material using for our systems. Those, keep going.
So like a big hydrometer, like what he's talking about, is like the oldest way to measure seawater, and if it's made by hand and it's done properly, it's going to be really, really accurate. It takes a little bit more work to put it into a giant cylinder with what, a gallon of water?
A liter.
Right, but that's the analog way to do it. And that's the thing about digital things, digital devices, you can get yourself into trouble if you don't know how to use them. So let me show you this thing a little bit more. So a conductivity meter basically has a couple probes that measures conductivity between them. Hannah put together one that's made with graphite, so it's not going to corrode the same way that the metal conductivity meters would. One unique peculiarity about this device is you cannot calibrate it with a seawater reference solution, right? So if you stick this thing in 35 parts per thousand seawater and you tell it it's 35 ppt seawater, it does not calibrate the same way. You have to use a 35 parts per thousand conductivity solution to calibrate it. But this is one of my favorite things because it's so fast going around the studio and just kind of plunking it in the water. It feels like I'm cheating. But I'm going to
get one to try it out.
I've measured it next to a digital refractometer, so the device on the bottom is basically a tabletop version of what you would use, put a drop on and look through the water and look at the diffraction. And Hannah made it also waterproof. And one of the greatest things about this, it's 60 bucks. It's 60 bucks, it's super cheap, it's super reliable. And that is so much faster than using a refractometer.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we use, actually, I'm the only one at the facility that uses the hydrometer because they are not cheap if you get a really good one. And if I break it, it's on me. But we used the Milwaukee meter for our salinity for all my employees to test. And the nice thing about having the real floating hydrometer is I can check, if I think something's weird, I can check it with the hydrometer and say, okay, the refract is off, we got to get it calibrated. And these are great, but they do have some downfalls.
You can get yourself into trouble. I have the same exact $200 jumbo Dupla analog hydrometer he's talking about. But again, if I ever thought that the readings were a little bit weird, I'd just go straight back to the analog reference. That's the one that you can just really, really count on.
And it's not a bad idea if the people are using these and they're questioning it down the road. If they have a shop that they go to, hey, how do you calibrate yours, and how can you guarantee that your salinity is correct and mine is not? If they don't have a hydrometer, it's something to maybe suggest or purchase one yourself.
So this is the reason I kind of emphasize the using parts per thousand for salinity is we've had a lot of presentations today from folks who do science with local corals, and they're using centimeters, and they're using Celsius, and they're using parts per thousand or PSUs. So if we can all just get on PPT, we could talk to the scientists a little bit more better. So let's get to that. So I have an intern that tests my water. He's 16 years old, and you know how those kids can be distracted. So all along the way, I was trying to figure out a protocol where it would reduce any kind of error. And so surprisingly, one of the things that takes a long time to test water is the setup. Simply just grabbing the boxes off the shelf, opening them up, getting everything lined up in a particular way, that could take almost as long as testing the water itself. So to alleviate that, there's actually a company called Printed Reefing Solutions. They've been making a lot of really cool niche accessories. So they have these 3D printed little stations that are made for different types of test kits. So the one with all the ovals would be for API, for all your liquid reagents. The one before is probably for Red Sea because it has different sized cylinders. And you can see a lot of them have these little pegs sticking up, and that's the drying rack for your vials.
That's one of the biggest problems I have to deal with is whether they have clean vials when they're testing. My employees are testing the water, and it's probably the most important thing I have. My one guy do is make sure the water parameters and make sure the test vials are clean. It's something I'm gonna have to get my hands on. It's the first time I saw it was today.
There's actually, I'm still dabbling into some of this more laboratory equipment. It's not even equipment, it's just like laboratory accessories. But you can get these drying racks for all sizes of test tubes. But what's really neat is Printed Reefing Solutions has made them so they kind of interlock. So you can grab a few of these together and just kind of pull them out, all as one single piece. So that's one of the things that we do at the studio to keep everything organized.
It's like you said, it's one of the longest processes that we have to deal with, and to make sure that it's done correctly. And these little things right here will make it much easier. We have 5 coral systems that are about 2,000 gallons apiece, and to test the water 3 times a week, it's 6-8 hours worth of time. And I like the idea of having this to make it a little easier for them to collect everything all at once. especially with what you're about to show here in a little bit.
So if you guys take nothing else away from this talk, I really want you to pay attention to this next clip. Sampling water. Who here is testing their water, and you put the tube in, and you put the tube in a little bit more, and then you look, see if it's right, and you got a little too much, and you got to pour it out, and you got to pour it out. How many times do you have to do that for one freaking sample?
Exactly. I mean, that right there is time consuming, and like I said a minute ago, what you're about to show us is something that I'm going to have to get my hands on, so that it saves my guys some time and make sure they're doing an accurate test with the correct amount of water in each test.
So as he was saying, it just takes a long time. Every little step takes a long time. If you can streamline all those little steps together, you can just get those overall testing times down. So this is a pipetter. It's basically a fancy, jobby. It's got a cone kind of on the bottom. Some of them are either set for a specific volume or they're adjustable. So this one right here is, I think it goes up to 11 milliliters. It was $50 on Amazon, you guys. And so, when we're setting up the tests, we line up all the vials. First, we take the organizer that we just showed you, set that all down, go to every tank and grab a big water sample from each one, and then you can just sit down, and with one of these pipetters, you can preload every single test you're going to do from every single. So it's just, you just squeeze it down, bring it over to the other vial, and press it again,
and for 50
you're full.
bucks, how much can you lose? I mean, corals are, putting a value on corals for me is not something that I like to do, but a lot of people can only afford so much for their aquarium, and to spend $50 for accuracy on your test to make sure that your water parameters are where they need to be is a super important thing. And how much money would that person lose that really does think about how much they spend on the aquarium, to spend $50 to save them, first of all, the animal's life, to make sure that things are set up right, and the money that they would save by keeping those animals alive.
This device introduces a level of repeatability that you can duplicate from my system to his protocols, right? So I really trust my 16-year-old when he tests 3 different parameters across 5 tanks. He already knows if the value is way off from last week, he'll test it again. But most of the time, he's like always right. And
that's how my guy is too.
I think this is one of those things that just really helps him with that confidence. The sampling is really, really important.
We use the iDip for the majority of our, the calcium, alkalinity, magnesium.
Tell them what the iDip is.
The iDip is a handheld spectrophotometer. It allows you to test your alkalinity, calcium, magnesium. We first got it so that we could test copper in our fish system, because most copper tests are a titration kit with a color wheel, and it's like, okay, this person thinks it's this color, I think it's this color, and getting an accurate reading was very difficult. So when we found the iDip, we could test for copper, which gave us a digital reading. And when we got it, we found that it was pretty consistent. And that sold me on the fact that we were able to know where our copper level was, for one, to make sure that we're not overdosing our copper, because certain fish are really sensitive to it, others are not. And it really helped us to get the proper dosage in without actually guessing at what a color was. So when we noticed that that was working really well for us, I started using the alkalinity, the calcium, and then the magnesium, which is a calibration between the total hardness and the calcium. A little bit, I don't do that particular test. I let my other guys do all that. I'm not the tech guy. But it made such a difference in getting a digital reading that was consistent versus viewing a color change.
And how much is the iDip and the reagents?
It's, I think they're $340 retail, and the reagents are like $25 for 100 tests.
So what we're trying to do here is present you with kind of like the spectrum from, advanced hobbyists with a lot of tanks going into the commercial aquaculture. So if a $350 iDip is not necessarily in your budget, maybe a $50 titrator with the test kits that you're using is going to help streamline your process. And they come in all kinds of sizes. These are actually electronics, so you can actually set them to even be more accurate. And you press the button and it just sucks it all up. And you press another button and it squirts it all down. Again, the one that I got was a $50 device on Amazon. It's like $50. And the tapering tips that is actually in contact with the water, those are replaceable. It's just like $2 for a pack of 5 or 6.
That's something that I've never seen before too, until you showed it to me today. That's why Jake's always got all the newest and greatest things out there. I always like to see some of the things that he has, that he wants to talk about. And it's something that I would like to incorporate with my guys, of course, for making sure they're getting accurate, because we don't just use the iDip. I mean, you can never rely on one particular test, in my opinion. I mean, if you're relying on Salifert or you're relying on Red Sea or any of the other test manufacturers out there, you know, there's inconsistencies in everything that's made for the hobbyist because it is not scientifically up to date. How do I say it? Is that right?
Yeah.
So if you want scientific analysis, a good ICP test every month, every 2 months on your system is always really good. And it's something that we do. But because we use the iDip for the majority of our tests, when we see something that's kind of off, we go back to we'll use a Salifert kit. And in Salifert, what we found was that your alkalinity, when you test it at 8.5, you're really at 7.5. When you're at 9.5, you're really at 8.5. It's about a point higher reading than what it really is. And we learned that from doing our ICP tests. So when we did our ICP test with our iDip tests, we found that the iDip was closer to what the ICP was than that was actually done. It's something at the request when you send an ICP out, and it blew my mind how off all the different test kits were. So always keep that in mind, especially for somebody that's keeping euphyllias. They are so sensitive to a alkalinity level that is below like 7.6, which is natural seawater. And with all of this different measuring devices, I mean, it's gonna make such a difference to see if I can actually measure exactly what we're supposed to on a 4 mil for a Salifert kit. Is it really 1 point off, or is it because we're not measuring the correct amount of water?
If you're not familiar with ICP tests, you don't really need to know how it works, but it's a service. You send away your water, and I think it's really beneficial at 2 extremes, whether your tank is doing really well or if your tank is doing really poorly. If it's really doing poorly, obviously you want to identify some problems. If it's doing really well, then you have kind of a snapshot of the chemistry of why your corals are doing so well. So this device here is kind of a small little magnetic stirrer. You know, some of us have been testing water for a long time. We have the dexterity to titrate and mix at the same time. But as you'll see here in this video, it's a tiny little magnetic stirrer. And another thing that I use for the titration test, since it's color changing, is I have a specific light that I always use nearby, so the ambient light doesn't affect my perception of the color of the test. So I think, there we go. So yeah, there's some of these things that you have to mix all the time. I think this is really most useful in our cases for when we're testing phosphate, because it needs a lot of mixing time, and just want to make sure to have that repeatability and make everything very consistent from day to day and from tank to tank.
You said phosphate. You know, one of the things that I always had a problem with was, of course, the titration kits for phosphate. If you can save your money, or even know somebody that has a Milwaukee phosphate meter, these are the best. I mean, they measure you down to the 0.00 parts per million, and I always had a problem with the titration kits and the color change to actually see, okay, what really is it, And the Milwaukee meter it's not cheap. It's like $320, $350, but it will give you a really accurate measuring of what your phosphates is. And a lot of people like to monitor that, and we like to keep ours at like 0.2, 0.02, 0.03, and you can't really get that out of a titration kit. So if you're measuring phosphates and it says there's nothing, either the iDip or the Milwaukee meter, I still use that over the iDip because it's an easier test.
One common discussion that we have a lot is how all of you guys are trying to keep the hardest possible reef tank that there is. You're trying to keep sticks at the top, LPS in the middle, softies on the side. And if you go diving in the natural reef, you'll see that habitats are dominated primarily by one group of corals. So in a commercial setting, or what I've done is I have a tank for euphyllia, I have a tank for LPS, I have a system just for acros, I have a tank just for Montipora, right? If you really drill down, the needs of Montipora are going to be, they can be more specific than Stylophoras and especially acros. An acro-tuned aquarium is actually going to be too much energy for most Montipora species.
And Jake's been in our facility, and we worked so hard because we don't have a large facility, and we can't have separate setups for our acroporas, our soft corals, and all of our LPS corals. We've developed a method that really does work for keeping them all together, but it required 6-foot by 12-foot tanks that are 2 feet deep with different levels for different lights. And we put the meadow halides down the middle and low light on the side, but the parameters are the hardest thing that we had to figure out, and we had to learn that, you know, there's only so much in a day that you can give super intense light to if you want to keep your LPS happy, and you don't want to take too much away from the SPS because you won't keep them happy. So 4 hours a day on super intense light, the rest of the time the levels are so low, people are like, how is the coral even growing? Well, they're growing because of the fact that we feed so much. I mean, we feed more than probably most anybody would even think. It's 5 pounds of reef-roids every 3 months.
There's definitely been an inversion in the hobby, probably within the last couple or 3 years, where we're trying to get rid of nutrients, trying to get the phosphate down, trying to get phosphate down. And now somehow, like a lot of us, our tanks are just naturally clean, not with any specific technique of using a lot of lanthanum or GFO or aluminum oxide or algae scrubbers, but we're finding our tanks are starving, right? So definitely, you know, I keep my SPS at 0.01, as you was mentioning with the phosphates, and then I have a gradient of nutrients. This is a good time to mention that the chemistry, the mineral chemistry, for pretty much all the corals should be the exact same, pretty much the same.
Yep.
Montes might be a little bit more sensitive to lower magnesium, but the nutrient profile, that's where it gets a little bit more different out on the reef.
And that's where, you know, when we, over the years, 13 years of doing this, that we've, you know, slowly figured out that if you keep a balance of nutrients in your system that your LPS like, but your SPS don't necessarily like, if you balance your light for them as well as for your LPS corals, and you feed to supplement with your SPS, you end up getting a really good balance in your system, and everything can live in harmony, and you can actually have a 2,200 gallon system with 25 to 30,000 fragments growing plus mother colonies, and they thrive. And that's one of the accomplishments that we've come to with a big system, is just knowing stability in your water parameters for your minerals, and then finding out how you have to balance out it. Every system's different. Even my new system was different, setting up the balances that we needed. You know, there's a Redfield ratio for nutrients, and we have an algae scrubber on there that really helps us be able to
he's lost me at the algae scrubber. I don't like relying on biology that could be fickle to do some of these processes.
So you would rather use chemical to remove those nutrients?
It makes
versus the natural process?
It really depends on the size of the system, right? If my system's only a couple hundred gallons, I could throw GFO and aluminum oxide at it all day. But if you're dealing with 2,000 gallons, it might make more financial sense to use a big algae scrubber.
But why wouldn't the entire reefing community want to use something like a scrubber to remove those nutrients and keep things balanced versus using a chemical in your aquarium that lowers your alkalinity? And can build up in time.
I'm deliberately dosing GFO in one system to bring the alkalinity down.
Well,
but this is a good time to also let you know that most of you guys are probably on your first, second, maybe fifth tank, and all your tanks, I'm sure, is this huge just collection of corals from every part of the reef, and you are trying to do the hardest thing possible. Every time I see a question on some of the local forums about somebody's problem that they're having, it's a mixed reef. It's a mixed reef, and they're worried about one coral out of 100 that's doing poorly. There's times that you just have a weak sissy coral.
Happened to me the other day.
Every now and then you see a dead coral, I don't even freak out. I'm like, that's a sissy coral. Let me tell you about a couple other funky tricks that I've come up with at the studio. The studio is more for display, right? So everything's high clarity glass, and with high clarity glass, you see everything. If that water is not super clear, you can see that yellow tint to the water. If there's any kind of spots of algae on the glass or spots of salt splash on the outside of the glass, it shows. So several years ago, I was actually at a German facility called White Corals, and they had something I didn't even know existed, a power squeegee. It is unbelievable, you guys.
I'm gonna have to get me on a hold of them for
if you've ever worked at an aquarium store and you've had to wipe down tanks, you can imagine how much of your life you spent doing the Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi thing here with your paper towels and your thing. If you use a regular squeegee, it wipes everything away. But a lot of times it's going to leave a very lightly salty residue on the tank, and you can still streak your finger across it and you know it's not clean. The power squeegee, again, it's like $60, $70 on Amazon.
you some of these because we have 32 feet double-sided, 3-tiered, and I have to pay somebody to go through and do that, and then I'm always like, did you even squeegee these? You know, this right here would probably save a ton of time for us so definitely something I would recommend, especially if it's making sure your tank looks good for when you have family and friends over.
And it's fun. It's actually really, really fun to use. It's so satisfying. You know, you spray down the glass and just get this perfectly clean glass. We worked so hard to get the reef inside looking so nice and clean and presentable. Everybody here has room to have more respect for their own aquariums by keeping your glass clean inside and out. So power squeegee, that's a good one, but that's a little bit more for the display side. But if you have a store or you have a lot of maintenance accounts, this thing is just a total lifesaver. This is the last thing I want to share with you, but it was actually inspired by a modification I saw at his facility and some others, where they had basically stripped down their bandsaw to prevent that pool of water. If the way a bandsaw works basically is you have like just a very shallow pool of water, and if you're cutting a bunch of corals through there, that's a lot of coral slime and grit and funk that's building up.
We had.
Tell me about some of your issues.
We frag so many corals at ACI. You know, we're making 2,500 coral fragments a week that go in 3/4-inch frag plugs, and one of the biggest problems that we would have, you know, we sell farmed corals, as well as there's a huge demand for, I call them chop shop, other people call them conditioned. I don't think there's any reason to sugarcoat it. There's no reason to sugarcoat what it is. It's a coral that's wild that we cut up into pieces. And one of the things that we used to have problems with was the reservoir in the Gryphon, and then other saws that we would have that weren't constantly getting a freshwater, you know, a fresh saltwater drip going over them to clean them out, and with a good drain, was if you have, say, for an example, Acan echinata. You know, they have a really nasty stinging cell. Anybody that has Acan echinata can know that if you put something close to it, more than likely the echinata is going to eat it. You know, it's going to take care of it and move it out of its way so it can grow into that space and time. So when you're fragmenting an Acan echinata, you know, a lot of people don't think about this, and we had to learn the hard way, is when you fragment that coral, if you don't clean that saw immediately afterwards, anything you frag afterwards is probably going to have problems. You're not going to maybe kill everything. But what Jake was showing here was, he saw at our place is we have a reservoir that sits up here, goes over the bandsaw, and then all the water goes down into a tray, which then has a drip line that goes into a 5-gallon bucket. And then every time we change corals, we run a fresh saltwater reservoir through the saw so that we can make sure that any stinging cells that might be left over from, say, the echinata, that we might be fragging a Favites or a Fabia.
If you're fragging a bunch of corals, you know, every coral after is getting literally inoculated with these sheared up, stressed up
from multiple species
and slime from all kinds of different corals. So
save your corals when you're fragging them and clean your saw. It might take some time for you to do it, but if you're doing multiple things at once, don't ever just do a coral, then grab another coral and frag another coral. Clean your saw a little bit.
The tile saw was developed for tiles.
Exactly.
No one should be using a tile saw stock as it is. When I got my tile saw, I found myself hesitant to use it because I know how much I would have to clean it, and you know, you have to kind of dump it all over and just kind of wipe it down. It was just a super pain. So with a few modifications, I put together this flow-through bandsaw. So I have a reservoir above it, just super simple, just some water line going down to, right to the sponge that cleans off the blade, you know, that goes around. And I just happen to have mine set up right next to the sink, so it can flow all night long. I can just go do something else, but it's always constant fresh water there.
Very
and
important.
Since I have it right next to the sink, I can pull that tray off and just pull the spray nozzle and just kind of hose down the inside, because there's a lot of grit that goes inside. But just keep in mind, the tile saw is designed to cut tile,
exactly,
not live coral. So any of you coral fraggers out there really should be modifying them.
We go through one a month. I mean, they don't last long for us on the scale that we're doing, but we haven't found a commercial one, something big enough that's even affordable that we would be comfortable with purchasing. So we just keep going through these hobbyist saws, and you know, we get 2 running at a time pretty much all day long, and it's just a matter of making sure it's cleaned up. And if you're gonna, at the end of every time we use the saw, we use a plant-based lubricant to clean the saw, and that's very important too, because you'll get a little bit more life out of it, and you won't have to worry about toxins from WD-40 or something like that hitting your corals down the road when you're sawing. But definitely.
As I was setting up a lot of tanks at the Reef Aquarium studio in Denver, which is a mile high, the air's super thin, we have a ton of evaporation. I mean, I remember working in the aquarium shops, it would be totally normal to give a 125-gallon tank 5 gallons per day, every single day. That's when we were running metal halides and a little bit hotter. But so one of the things, I didn't have a way to show you what I did at the studio, but instead of using one big vat, I got a bunch of different pickle barrels and put them up in the air on some shelves, and you can just link them together with some RO line. And I had used, and these are super cheap. You can find these on Craigslist, on local for sale forums. They should be like 20 to 50 bucks depending on the quality and depending if they come with a lid or not. And a lot of times they're used for soy sauce or pickles or tomato or ketchup or things like that. So even if they have a little bit of stain inside, it's not a big deal. But instead of getting a 200-gallon vat for $300-something, I was able to get, I think, 4 pickle barrels for about 120 bucks with good fitting lids. And I have one reservoir that is linked to every tank in the studio for top off.
Tell them how you cleaned them first before you allow them to be used for your aquariums.
The ones I got were super clean.
Okay, okay. If somebody's going to go do that, I mean, we buy them all. When we need new ones, we buy them from a local place, and they usually have pickles or olives or something in it, and it's whatever's holding them. We always make sure that we run, soak them in fresh RO water, because RO water is the most corrosive on the planet. It's just straight water, and it'll absorb any of the residuals that might be in the pores of the plastic. So don't just go buy a pickle barrel and use it. Make sure you put RO water in it, and then we always end up dumping after it's been in there for a while.
It'll be fine, y'all. It'll be fine. Yeah. But again, with the local forums, once a week, man, it never fails. Someone asks, what's the best auto top off? And every time, like a smart ass, I answer, gravity.
Float valve.
Gravity is the best auto top off. I've been using these larger, not the little dinky ones, these larger float valves for 20 years. I've never had one fail. Every few months I just go and give them a little wiggle, make sure there's not a little piece of grit or something stuck in them.
Same exact
but I top off, I fill up 200 gallons of water for all the tanks in the studio every 3 weeks. Now compare that if I had an auto top off to every single tank. I would need a float sensor, or maybe 2. I would need a feed pump. I would need a controller, and I would need a little power supply to drive all of that. So that's 4 points of failure for every single ATO out there.
Try to eliminate your points of failure in any system. Just that right there is one of the biggest problems with people that have in this industry, is they have so much equipment that there's so many points of failure on it. Try to eliminate that as much as you can. In my opinion, simple is better and easier. Float systems like this for your
every tank,
top off.
For every single tank. Yeah. This is one way that you can just, boom, cut out 4 points of failure from your tank. I know it seems fancier, it seems better because you paid more for it, because it's high tech, because it's got lights and it makes sounds and beeps, but I promise you, man, gravity will not fail you. So yeah, this is just a bunch of little nuggets of information we want to share with you. We kind of want to bring a little bit more industry side, but hopefully some of you that have just a few tanks or one tank, picked up some information. Do you have anything else you want to add to that?
You and I talked earlier about, how you maintain you use dosing pumps to make sure that your systems get the proper alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium. And we use calcium reactors. And stability, of course, as everybody knows, is the key thing. Depending on what you have and the size of the system that you have, dosing pumps I think are great. If you have something that's a little larger, something for you to think about, save you a lot of money once you figure them out and learn how to use them. And there's also automatic ones. I don't know much about what that is, but a calcium reactor will save you a lot of time and keeps things more stable. And adjustments on it are just a matter of trial and error and learning how to use them.
It should be a little bit more clear in this hobby, I think, on that we should be all striving for one chemistry. Talking about minerals, we should all be striving for one chemistry. The seawater is very homogenized all over the oceans, but how we achieve that, that's the discussion, right? We should all be aiming for the same alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, more or less within a range. But if you have a nano tank, you don't put a dosing pump on that thing. Don't even bother testing the water. Just change all the water, or most of it, once a week or every 2 weeks.
20-gallon tank, 5-gallon water change,
as you get it to about a 30, 40-gallon tank, depending on how many corals you have in there, then you might start considering using a doser just for the alkalinity. And then as your tank gets a little bigger or your mineral demands increase, then it starts making more sense to use a calcium reactor. Yeah. So I have a 20-gallon tank. I will never test the water on it. I will never dose it. I will just do 50% or plus water changes from larger reefs. I have 200-gallon systems. I use dosers for that because I don't want too many things to plug into the studio because it just makes me nervous to have too many devices. And then lastly, in my 500-gallon system, I have a calcium reactor, and I just dose magnesium to make up for the magnesium that it doesn't.
So you don't use the actual like remag that the Julian sells? It's dolomite.
It doesn't add enough magnesium, in my experience.
Well, what's your pH of your reactor?
Excuse me?
What's the pH of your reactor?
I don't know. It's saturated. I have the Twin Tech, and it's
Oh,
automatic.
okay. So anything, but that's the other thing. Okay, on a calcium reactor, if you're going to be using it for your magnesium media as well, which you can put magnesium media in your calcium reactor, if you don't have your pH below like 6.7, you're not going to dissolve the magnesium media.
There's just
you
need so much magnesium in seawater,
it helps to keep it from being depleted quicker if you have it above the 6.7. But we've noticed that with our systems in the beginning, we were keeping our reactors at 7.0 to dissolve the media, and we were dosing. I mean, imagine a system that you have to literally take a 5-gallon bucket of magnesium chloride.
It's cheap.
Anhydrous isn't cheap. And you go through that a month to keep the magnesium level right. Once you get the right magnesium level in your reactor with the pH proper, it'll keep it so stable you'll never dose the magnesium again. That's from a small system standpoint to what we do, it's so interesting to hear how people maintain, especially magnesium. And like we've talked about, you can just dump magnesium in your system and it doesn't hurt the corals, and it takes so much of it to get it from even 100 points up.
Pretty much all of you could go home and add liters of magnesium to your tank.
And you wouldn't hurt anything.
Your magnesium would go up like 20 parts per million.
Exactly. And it doesn't have any detrimental effects on the corals whatsoever. Don't do that with alkalinity or calcium.
This was a really cool opportunity to talk to you guys about some topics that I don't think get spotlit very much on a purely kind of a industry event like MACNA or Reef Stock, where we're trying to entertain you guys with some good speakers, or purely scientific workshops where it's just all about science, science, science. So really want to thank Waterbox for having us out here, the MC for introducing everyone. And if you guys have any questions about some tips and tricks or things that are affecting your tank, go ahead and shoot.
Thank you.
Anyone? Don't be afraid. Yes, yes. Big round of applause. Come on, yet again, you got access to 2 big brains in the industry here. There we go. I knew somebody would raise their hand first.
Best frag glue.
Best frag glue, go.
All of them. I mean, it's not like they're all coming from the same factory.
Yeah,
the same factory ships that gel to other places, and they ship them to other places, and then people put them in different jars and things. If you use a lot of glue, maybe like the CoralFX comes in a big jar.
We use that.
Ecotech Marine's got a big thing of glue. I've really taken to the little grenades of super glue from Paul's lab, because I can always have a small fresh one. So for me, that's the most practical. For him, it probably doesn't make any sense.
No, we use 295 mils probably a day when we're using it. We use the CoralFX. I do like the Polyp Lab, but they haven't gotten me a big enough jar to use on the scale that we're fragmenting corals. But we've used the Ecotech. I've used a bunch of different ones, and I've just gone back to the CoralFX because it's easy for me to get like that overnight.
The glues are almost all the same. Some of them are a little stickier. Some of them harden a little faster. You want the middle of the road, but I think more important than the glue that you use is how you cut the coral, right? So when I grab an acro, I will go up there with the coral cutters, I will snap, 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 and then I take those branches over to the saw to get a nice, perfect, flat surface, because then you need a drop of super glue. Once you put it on the thing, you can literally pick up your frag plug almost instantly.
The only time I use something other than a CoralFX is when we're doing, say, Seriatopora bird's nest. They're the worst to actually get to stand up. I mean, you can put a big glob of glue on there, but then you got this big glob at the bottom. If you have access to the Polyp Lab glue, for some reason, you can put the littlest dab on there, and it really sticks that coral for us. And they slime up a lot, and that's one of the corals that's probably my hardest to make fragments of, that we don't have to continuously go back and repair and re-glue. And it's either use the Polyp Lab glue for us, or get plugs made specifically that have an 1/8 inch diameter hole in it, so that we can just stick the coral fragment down inside of it. So But for glue, I mean,
It's how
so
you use
much.
it. You want to make sure it's fresh. There's old glue out there that's not going to be sticky enough. It might come out looking the same, but you'll see that it doesn't adhere.
Keep it in the freezer too.
And
I may be using too much. That may be my.
Yeah. Also, another thing that I do
yeah.
when I go to frag corals is I put together my frag bases first, and I put them all out, and I put a dab of glue on there. It takes 20 minutes for it to harden without being touched. So I'll do all the dabs, then I'll go, take the coral, do the fragging, and by the time I'm ready to put them on the disc, they've started pre-curing just a little bit.
We do things a little bit differently. I mean, I try to tell my guys every day at the end of the day to make sure that the glue that they're using goes back in the freezer, and it makes it even thicker. Now, it doesn't take long when you're in Florida in 85-degree weather, and we don't have a climate-controlled environment that we're in, but that does make it different when it's thicker coming out. It makes it easier for certain fragments. Other stuff, it doesn't really matter. But if like an aquapora frag, if you're using the cutters to cut it and you don't have access to that saw to break it off, glue with more viscosity to it will make it easier for you to keep that fragment upright the way you want it versus having to sit there and hold it, dip it, and hold it. I mean, when you're making 1,000 frags at a time and putting them on there, it'd be a long, drawn-out process to actually do it. But cutting your fragment flat and keep your glue in the freezer.
Okay, I have another question. I have a Hanna phosphate test kit, and the reagent that comes in the little packet. How the heck do you get all that out and make sure you get it all in? I don't trust.
I got a good
my.
answer. So as part of our protocol, I didn't get totally deep into it because everybody's on. But hey, I have scissors. I just have some nice Ecotech Marin coral fragging scissors because I have a ton from years past. Just cut them across, then I stick it in the packet, and then open it up. And then you get a nice diamond-shaped opening. And you don't have to get every single last granule. We're not trying to prove scientific hypothesis.
You just want a good idea of what you're getting.
You just stick the scissors in, twist, open it up, and then you have a nice little diamond-shaped opening.
I mean, that's the thing. You'll
learn the technique.
On the hobbyist side of it, you guys can get equipment that, and test kits that are going to give you a really good idea. There's going to be a margin of error and all that. The only way you're going to get your true analysis is if you do an ICP. And it doesn't hurt. I mean, it's a little bit of money to send off that ICP test, but what's your tank worth to you? Once, twice a month, make sure that your parameters are what your test kits are showing by sending that ICP off. And then you have a digital recording of it on your computer. You can say, okay, this month it was this. And if you do it around the same time every month, you can kind of get an idea of where your swings are and how your testing is going.
Great, thanks. Anybody else? I have a question. Oh, good. I'll hold mine.
What are your feelings on hang over the back refugiums to try to keep nutrients in check?
Don't get me started.
No?
I mean, I'll give I've done refugiums with Miracle Mud. I've done, just straight refugiums with Chaeto, and I've had, mixed results from all of that. On our scale with the 2,200 gallon system that has, 30,000+ coral fragments in it and all the other colonies that we're farming in that one particular system, it's 2,200 gallons. To feed the corals with the balance that we're trying to do with keeping SPS and LPS together, we had such a problem with it, and I was using, I had 5-gallon buckets of lanthanum chloride sitting there to keep my phosphates down if we were going to feed once a week. And the refugium that we had on there just wasn't keeping up with it. Refugiums are great. They're great for harboring, microfauna that are beneficial to the aquarium or to the whole reef.
Overrated.
What's that?
Overrated. The problem with refugiums is that people use that term a little bit too loosely. Technically or historically, a refugium is, a refuge area where you would have a sand zone, a rubble zone, maybe a rock zone. So, that deep sand bed is supposed to, process some of the nutrients, and then you might throw some chlorper on there. But by combining all those things, you're weakening each component. Now, he doesn't use refugium. He uses an algae scrubber. And there's two types. You have the macroalgae scrubber, which is probably the most suitable for most folks, is your Ketomorpha reactors. There's some great ones. The Pax Bellum is American made. That's kind of like the Cadillac. Toonsy's got another one, but that's macroalgae. If you want to take out nutrients, macroalgae, Ketomorpha is going to do the job. A lot of people throw the term refugium when within their mind, they're actually picturing an algae scrubber. And I came to this conclusion because I've visited reef tanks all over the world. I do it all the time, every single year. And I have never seen an aquarium display, a reef aquarium display, whose success was because they had a refugium, and most of them did not. You know, limit the factors. He's doing something different, right? He is trying to grow a ton of corals. It's not a coral display. And he has to feed a ton to keep all the corals happy. And the most effective thing he can do is use a turf scrubber or an algae scrubber, but he's not using
We
typical
currently
refugium.
remove 0.2 ppm of phosphates per day, and we add every other day we add about 0.5 ppms of phosphates with all of the reefroids that we feed. 5-pound buckets of reefroids every 3 months is what we go through in a 2,200-gallon system. I mean, there's not many people that, you know, if you took a 120 gram in a 220-gallon aquarium and you fed that in the time period that we're feeding a 5-pound bucket to our system, most people's tanks would crash because their nitrates would go through the roof and their phosphates would go through the roof. But if you want to feed your corals a lot, you know, I agree with you on everything you just said, but if you really want to feed, and watch your corals really grow, and in my opinion, corals get fed naturally by capturing food all day long, every day when they're in the wild. We can't necessarily mimic that in an aquarium because it's a closed system. So what I found over the last year and a half of using an algae scrubber is it allowed me to do that and more. But then there's so many things that come upon that also affect the system. Is you got macroalgae or microalgae that are growing on your scrubber that are robbing the trace minerals from your corals, and then you have to do all this other, believe me, it's a never-ending process of learning something new. That's why I love what I do every single day. But a refugium, I don't see a problem with anybody having it on their aquarium, but don't expect it to do exactly what it's supposed to do according to what people say.
Well,
if you want to feed a lot, get yourself a turf scrubber, because you're going to be able to feed more than you ever possibly could, because the refugium and chaeto and other macroalgae aren't going to be absorbing the nutrients as quickly as the algae that would naturally grow in your aquarium. They're going to grow in the turf scrubber, not in your aquarium, and they're going to remove everything. Our system, we are fortunate that this turf scrubber that we have on there keeps us from having any major algae issues whatsoever. I used to have to scrub my plugs every 3 months. Imagine paying an employee to scrub 30,000 coral plugs weekly because you had this nasty algae growing. And as soon as the turf scrubber started doing its job properly, which took about 3 months, I was like, wow, it was $1,500 for this massive scrubber that we put on here, and I'm saving that in a month from not paying employees to actually scrub, and I'm able to feed my corals more, so my corals are growing faster. It's, you know, so
when refugiums were first introduced in the late 90s, we didn't really know what to do with our reef tanks. We were really trying to recreate the miniature reef in every zone and every ecological process. But over the last 20 years, I've been particularly, my reefing philosophy has been to strip away all the superfluous processes in a miniature reef aquarium. When a refugium was first introduced to the aquarium hobby, it was above the tank, right? So all the little goodies inside would flow down into the aquarium and hypothetically feed the fish and the corals and this and that. I don't technically even keep reef tanks anymore. I keep coral aquariums, right? I keep just enough structure to put my corals on, and then I'll take rocks out. I'm still taking rocks out. The longer I reef, the less rock that I have, because all this mixed biology adds to complexity and problems in your aquariums. And the reason I rail against refugiums, such as in my debate that was videotaped with Julian Sprung in 2014, is just people aren't focusing on the most important things. They talk about the refugium a lot, but it's, I don't know. Algae scrubber, yes. Refugium, no. What's yours?
All right. Yes. Anybody else before I? Mine's a quick one. I know we're running along. And Jake, this is for you, and it's a curiosity question. Maybe other people have it. You touched a little bit on it when you were talking about top off. What are some other unique challenges reef keeping at altitude? Do you have to aerate more, or heaters an issue, or is it just not?
To be honest, it's the opposite. The weather is super mild, so we don't really have these high temperatures. It can get cold, but it's easy to heat the tank and it's easy to warm your house. And I am starting to recognize some of the differences between high altitude reefing and sea level reefing, because a lot of people really love their Nios protein skimmers at sea level, but my Nios protein skimmers are really finicky up at higher altitude because probably the thin air allows them to choke on so much more volume of air that they're just really, really unstable. But also being able to evaporate a ton of water, I can add a ton of kalkwasser and just really keep my pH higher because I can evaporate some more. I don't really think there's any disadvantages that I can tell you, except for some weird misbehaving protein skimmers, because they're all going to be developed at sea level for the most part. But I do see some benefits.
So you don't have any issues with pH in your system, or do you, when you use your top off water, you add the kalkwasser to help maintain and keep that, or is that?
Bob might need to correct me on this, but the partial pressure is different at elevation, but the concentrations are the same.
Gotcha.
Interesting.
Okay. No,
I know every time I travel out there, you always talk about like how it takes longer to boil water and all these other little nuances. I didn't know if it ever played into the reef tanking thing with, you know, but
I would honestly say it's the opposite. You know,
really?
in the late 90s when I did a lot more retail and when everything was super new and the corals, like we could keep track of every single coral that came through because the hobby wasn't that big. We would, you know, bring a few pieces of coral in of a particular type. We'd sell them to some people in town, and there was a lot of people in the mountains who also kept coral. Man, those mountain reefers, they'd be bringing back those coral in so many pieces just in a few months, and we'd be like, what the hell are you doing? Now, I think there's an elevation thing due to, you know, different partial pressure, but I haven't really been able to identify it yet. But if anything, the mountain reefers usually were able to grow corals faster than the city reefers.
Were they using RODI water, or were they using just straight mountain stream water? Because maybe the minerals in there are one of the things that will help them grow.
Good old natural mountain stream water. All right, anybody, one final? We got time for one final one. Anyone? Once, twice? Huge round of applause yet again.
Good job.
Again, and you know, I just want to follow up on something that Jake said about, you know, we've given rounds of applause every day, but these guys have done so much. So like Jake said, you know, you see somebody in a Waterbox shirt, thank them personally because they've really gone above and beyond. So, yeah, I really like that sentiment. But gentlemen, thank you so much. You know, they'll be here all weekend. If you see them around, ask them. I know that everybody you've seen today is approachable and are able to speak.